It is December 19th or 20th, 1119 AD in the city of London. The streets, alive with trade during the day, have grown quieter as the evening draws near. In a modest home, surrounded by the hum of England's largest city, a child is born. His name is Thomas Becket. Born to a family of Norman merchants, no one, least of all his parents, could have imagined that this boy would rise to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, a trusted confidant of kings and ultimately a martyr. This child, who entered the world so quietly, would one day find himself at the center of a deadly power struggle. He would defend the church against royal authority and face his fate in a moment that would shock the medieval world. This is the story of Thomas Becket, a tale of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and a martyrdom that would echo through history. To understand the man who would defy a king and die a martyr, we must first step into the world of his childhood. Thomas Becket was born on December 19th or 20th, 1119, in the heart of London, then one of the largest and busiest cities in England. It was a city alive with trade, where merchants, labourers and nobles coexisted in a world shaped by commerce and ambition. His father, Gilbert Becket, was a Norman merchant, a man respected for his work and connections, but far removed from the nobility. Gilbert provided his family with stability, though their status remained modest. His mother, Matilda, a devout and moral woman, instilled in Thomas a strong sense of faith that would stay with him throughout his life. Growing up, Thomas witnessed the discipline and tenacity required to thrive in London's bustling markets. He watched his father negotiate deals, balance ledgers, and manage goods arriving from distant lands. It was here, amidst the clamour of trade, that Thomas learned the value of hard work and perseverance. But unlike many children of his class, Thomas was granted a gift that set him apart: education. His parents invested in his future, sending him to study at Merton Priory, a renowned school near London. There he studied Latin, the language of scholars and the church, as well as grammar, rhetoric, and the foundations of theology. At Merton, Thomas excelled. His teachers quickly noticed his sharp intellect and natural curiosity. While other boys played or daydreamed, Thomas immersed himself in his lessons, learning the skills that would one day propel him to greatness. His ambition and abilities soon led him beyond England. As a teenager, Thomas travelled to Paris, one of Europe's greatest centres of learning. Paris was a city filled with scholars, theologians, and ambitious students from across Christendom. There, he deepened his understanding of theology and philosophy, mastering the art of debate and the written word. But Thomas's education didn't stop there. Eager to gain more knowledge, he travelled to Bologna, Italy, Europe's leading centre for the study of canon law. Canon law, the legal system of the Church, governed not just the clergy, but many aspects of life across Christendom. In Bologna, Thomas developed an expertise in church governance and legal matters, skills that would later make him indispensable to kings and archbishops alike. When Thomas returned to England, now a young man in his 20s, he was well educated, ambitious, and ready to make his mark. His talents did not go unnoticed. He quickly entered the service of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, a powerful figure in the English Church. Theobald recognized Thomas's extraordinary abilities, his intelligence, work ethic, and gift for administration, and appointed him Archdeacon of Canterbury, one of the most influential positions in the Church. This role gave Thomas responsibilities over church lands, finances, and legal affairs, placing him at the centre of power. It was here, in Theobald's service, that Thomas Becket began his rise to prominence. His reputation for loyalty and competence grew, attracting the attention of another powerful figure, King Henry II. From a merchant's son to the Archdeacon of Canterbury, Thomas Becket's journey had only just begun. His rise would take him to the highest ranks of power, but it would also set him on a collision course with destiny. By the mid-12th century, England stood at a crossroads. After years of civil war under King Stephen, the country was fractured and order had to be restored. In 1154, a new king ascended the throne, Henry II, a man of great energy, ambition and intelligence. To rebuild his kingdom, Henry sought men he could trust, capable administrators who would enforce royal authority and secure the crown's power. It was Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury, Henry's trusted advisor, who introduced him to a man with a sharp mind, a tireless work ethic, and an unmatched ability to govern, Thomas Becket. In 1155, Henry appointed Becket as Chancellor of England, one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom. At just 36 years old, Becket was now the king's right hand, overseeing taxation, royal lands, and the enforcement of law and order. Henry had found his man, a loyal servant and a brilliant administrator. Becket threw himself into his new role with vigour. He collected taxes with ruthless efficiency, ensured the king's laws were enforced, and brought rebellious nobles to heel. In a kingdom still recovering from years of chaos, Becket's competence was unmatched. Henry and Becket became inseparable. The two men formed a bond that went beyond politics. They hunted together, dined together, and shared a sharp wit that few could match. Henry, known for his temper and restless energy, found in Becket a companion who could challenge and entertain him. Their friendship grew into something more, a partnership built on trust, ambition, and mutual respect. But Becket's loyalty to Henry came at a cost. As Chancellor, he often prioritized the king's interests over those of the church. He imposed heavy taxes on church lands, diverting wealth to fund Henry's campaigns and administration. This earned Becket criticism from many within the clergy, who questioned where his loyalties truly lay. Some whispered that he served the king more than God. Despite this, Becket continued to rise in influence. Henry trusted him implicitly, even sending him on critical diplomatic missions. In 1158, Becket was dispatched to France to negotiate with King Louis VII. Determined to impress, Becket travelled in extraordinary style. With over 200 attendants, dozens of horses and carts filled with luxurious gifts, Becket's mission was a spectacle. French nobles marvelled at his wealth, his charm, and his ability to represent England's power. By the time he returned, his reputation as Henry's most trusted and capable servant was firmly established. By now, Thomas Becket was living a life of power and privilege. He wore the finest silks, dined in the company of nobles, and moved confidently through the courts of kings. But Becket's world was about to change. In 1162, the death of Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury created a vacancy at the head of the English Church. For Henry, this was an opportunity. He saw the archbishopric as a way to tighten his control over the church in England. And who better to serve as archbishop than his most loyal and trusted man, Thomas Becket? But Becket hesitated. He knew what this appointment would mean. As Chancellor, he had served the king's interests. But as Archbishop of Canterbury, he would answer to God and the church. The two roles could not coexist. Becoming archbishop was not just a change of position, it was a transformation, one that Becket feared would drive a wedge between himself and Henry. Henry, however, was confident. He dismissed Becket's concerns and insisted he take the position. In June of 1162, Thomas Becket was consecrated as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest clerical office in England. What Henry did not realise was that his trusted Chancellor, his closest friend, would no longer serve him as he once had. Becket embraced his new role with unexpected zeal. He renounced his lavish lifestyle, wore simple robes, and dedicated himself to the spiritual leadership of the Church. Gone was the ambitious royal servant. In his place stood a man devoted to God, determined to protect the independence of the Church from royal interference. For Henry, this was a betrayal. He had elevated Becket to power, believing his loyalty would remain unshaken. But Becket saw his appointment as a sacred duty, one that demanded he resist the very king who had placed him there. The friendship between Henry II and Thomas Becket, once unbreakable, was now on a collision course. Two men, bound by trust and ambition, would soon find themselves locked in a deadly struggle for power and principle. What began as a partnership would end in blood and tragedy. When Thomas Becket accepted the position of Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, King Henry II believed he had made a brilliant decision. Becket, his loyal friend and trusted Chancellor, would now hold the highest position in the English Church. Henry assumed this meant he could extend royal authority into ecclesiastical matters, an ambition shared by many rulers of the time, but Henry had gravely miscalculated. Thomas Becket was no longer Henry's man. Once consecrated as Archbishop, Becket underwent a transformation. He renounced his life of luxury, embracing the humility and responsibility of his new spiritual role. Gone were the silks and feasts of his days as Chancellor. In their place stood a man clad in the plain robes of a priest, devoted to God and the independence of the Church. This transformation shocked Henry and marked the beginning of an ideological conflict that would engulf England for years. At the heart of the dispute lay a fundamental question: who held authority over the clergy, the king or the Church? One of the earliest and most bitter disagreements concerned the issue of benefit of clergy. In medieval England, members of the clergy accused of crimes were tried not in royal courts, but in church courts. These church courts often imposed far lighter punishments, even for serious offences. Henry, ever the reformer, saw this as an affront to justice and a challenge to his authority. He demanded that all clergy guilty of crimes be brought before his royal courts to face the same laws as ordinary citizens. But Becket refused. He argued that the clergy answered only to God and the Church. To allow secular courts to punish priests, he claimed, would undermine the sanctity of the Church's authority. This disagreement escalated into a public and bitter feud. In 1164, Henry convened the Great Council at Clarendon, where he introduced the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of laws designed to curb the Church's power and place it under royal control. Among the provisions, clergy accused of crimes would be handed over to royal courts. Bishops required royal approval to leave the kingdom, and appeals to the Pope would require the king's consent. Henry expected compliance. Becket, however, would not yield. To him, the constitutions of Clarendon were an attack on the Church's independence, a violation of its spiritual supremacy. Faced with immense pressure, Becket initially agreed to the laws, but soon after he recanted. He declared that he could not, in good conscience, accept terms that betrayed the Church's authority. Henry was furious. His most trusted friend had now become his most determined opponent. In retaliation, Henry sought to destroy Becket's position. He accused him of treason and corruption, summoning him to trial at Northampton Castle in October of 1164. There, surrounded by Henry's allies, Becket faced a hostile court determined to humiliate and convict him. Becket knew he stood no chance. The charges against him were political, not legal. Alone and isolated, he made a bold decision. Under the cover of night, Becket fled Northampton, travelling in disguise as a simple monk. He made his way to the coast, crossed the Channel, and arrived in France, where he sought the protection of King Louis VII and Pope Alexander III. Thus began Becket's long exile. For 6 years, from 1164 to 1170, Becket lived in monasteries in France, separated from his homeland and his cathedral. Yet even in exile, he remained relentless in his resistance. From abroad, he wrote letters to the Pope, bishops and clergy denouncing Henry's attempts to control the Church. He excommunicated Henry's allies, who enforced the constitutions of Clarendon, deepening the king's frustration. Henry, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated. Becket's cause won support across Europe, particularly from the Pope, who viewed Henry's actions as an attack on the Church itself. Even King Louis VII of France offered Becket his protection, further inflaming tensions between the two kingdoms. Despite the hostility, Henry knew the conflict could not continue indefinitely. He faced growing pressure from the Pope to reconcile with Becket and feared the possibility of excommunication himself, a fate that could weaken his rule and turn his nobles against him. In 1170, Henry and Becket agreed to a fragile truce. Henry allowed Becket to return to England, hoping to put the matter to rest. After 6 years in exile, Becket sailed home, greeted by cheering crowds who viewed him as a defender of the Church and a man who had suffered for his principles. But peace would not last. Upon his return, Becket quickly resumed his campaign against Henry's interference. He excommunicated several bishops who had supported the king during his absence, including those who had performed the coronation of Henry's son, an act Becket considered a grave overreach of royal power. This was the final insult. When news of Becket's actions reached Henry, the king erupted in anger. Accounts vary, but it is said that Henry cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether Henry's words were an order or a moment of frustration remains unclear, but for 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, it was enough. Convinced they were acting on the king's wishes, they rode toward Canterbury Cathedral with one purpose: to confront the man who had defied their king. The conflict between King Henry II and Archbishop Thomas Becket had reached its breaking point. What began as a struggle over power and principle was about to end in an act of violence that would shock all of Christendom. By the afternoon of December 29th, the knights had reached Canterbury. They entered the Archbishop's palace, demanding that Becket restore the excommunicated bishops and submit to the king's authority. Becket refused. He dismissed their threats with calm defiance. The knights left, but it was not over. Furious and humiliated, they armed themselves, donning chainmail and swords. They marched through the cloisters and toward the cathedral, determined to finish what they had begun. Inside Canterbury Cathedral, the air was cold and heavy. Monks moved silently through the aisles as the light of day faded. Becket, aware of the knights' intentions, was urged to take refuge, but he refused to hide. "This is the house of God," he declared, "and I will not flee." As the knights entered the cathedral, the clanking of their armor echoed off the stone walls. They called out for Becket, their voices harsh and unrelenting. When they found him near the altar, they surrounded him. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king?" they demanded. Becket stood his ground, his voice steady and clear. "Here I am," he replied, "no traitor, but a priest of God." The knights commanded him to submit to the king and undo the excommunications. Again, Becket refused. The knights shouted, demanding obedience, but Becket would not be moved. Finally, they drew their swords. The monks cried out in terror. Some ran to hide. Others pleaded with Becket to flee, but he raised his hand to silence them. "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the Church, I am ready to die," he said. The first blow struck him on the head. Becket staggered but did not fall. The second blow came with force, cutting deeper. The third blow felled him to his knees, blood pooling on the cold stone floor. Finally, as Becket lay defenseless, one of the knights delivered the fatal blow, shattering his skull. In the sacred silence of Canterbury Cathedral, the Archbishop of Canterbury lay dead. Blood soaked the stones of the altar where he had stood. His murderers fled, leaving chaos in their wake. The monks, weeping and horrified, gathered around Becket's lifeless body. They covered him in a cloak and carried him reverently to the crypt below. In the days that followed, word of his murder spread across England and beyond. Shock and outrage gripped the Christian world. To kill a priest and archbishop inside a cathedral, the very house of God, was an unthinkable crime. Henry II's knights had stained not only the altar, but the king's reputation and honour. But Thomas Becket's death was not the end of his story. Within hours of his murder, people began to speak of him as a martyr. Miracles were reported, pilgrims began to gather, and the church prepared to elevate him to sainthood. In seeking to silence Becket, his enemies had made him immortal. The murder of Thomas Becket sent shockwaves across Christendom. In the days that followed, the church and the people were united in their outrage. Word of Becket's death spread like wildfire, and whispers of martyrdom quickly emerged. To many, Thomas Becket had died not as a traitor, but as a defender of the church's independence. He had refused to submit to the demands of a king, choosing instead to stand firm for his faith. His blood, spilled at the altar, transformed him from a controversial figure into a symbol of unwavering courage. Almost immediately, reports of miracles began to circulate. Pilgrims who visited Canterbury Cathedral claimed that prayers offered near Becket's tomb brought about miraculous healings. The blind regained their sight, the sick were cured, and the crippled walked again. These stories spread across England and Europe, drawing crowds of pilgrims to the site of Becket's martyrdom. Such miracles were seen as undeniable proof of Becket's sanctity. Within a year of his death, Canterbury Cathedral had become a place of pilgrimage, with thousands travelling great distances to pay homage to the man now regarded as a saint. In 1173, just 3 years after his death, Pope Alexander III formally canonized Thomas Becket as a saint. It was one of the fastest canonizations in church history, a testament to the impact of his life and death. St. Thomas Becket's shrine in Canterbury Cathedral became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe. Pilgrims travelled from near and far, bringing offerings and prayers. The shrine itself, adorned with gold, jewels, and intricate carvings, became a dazzling centerpiece of devotion. Those seeking miracles brought candles, coins, and tokens of thanks. Monks carefully recorded the stories of miraculous healings, spreading Becket's fame even further. His shrine became so renowned that it later inspired Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by pilgrims on their way to honour St. Thomas. But while Becket was venerated by the faithful, his legacy cast a long shadow over King Henry II. The king's association with Becket's death had damaged his reputation. Henry was blamed for the murder, even though he had not explicitly ordered it. Public outrage and pressure from the Pope forced him to act. In 1174, Henry II performed a dramatic act of public penance at Becket's tomb. Barefoot and dressed in sackcloth, the king walked through the streets of Canterbury to the cathedral. There, he knelt before Becket's shrine, weeping and confessing his role in the events that had led to the Archbishop's death. Henry's penance was not just an apology, it was a recognition of the Church's enduring power. In seeking to control Thomas Becket, Henry had underestimated the strength of faith and the devotion of the people. Over the centuries, St. Thomas Becket's legacy endured. He became a symbol of resistance against oppression, of the Church's independence from secular authority, and of the ultimate sacrifice made in defense of faith. Even today, the story of Thomas Becket continues to inspire. Canterbury Cathedral remains a place of pilgrimage where visitors can walk in the footsteps of those who came before, seeking healing, hope, and a connection to the martyr who stood against a king. Through his life, his death, and his miracles, Thomas Becket achieved something greater than power or status. He became a saint, a martyr, and a timeless symbol of conviction and sacrifice. Thank you for joining us in this episode of On This Day in the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed this story about Thomas Becket, you won't want to miss our best video in this series, The Legend of Francis Drake Exposed. And don't forget to check out the most popular video on our channel, Anglo-Saxon Saga, The Long Road to United England. It's a deep dive into the struggles and triumphs that shaped English history. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the Middle Ages. Thanks for watching.